The clock struck midnight and the house was cloaked in an eerie silence. The only light came from the flickering television, casting long shadows across the living room. Kemi and Tunde, siblings who had just turned 18, sat side by side, their eyes locked on the screen. The movie they were watching was rated 18+, a bold and unflinching drama that had drawn them in with its raw intensity. Though they were adults, the scenes unfolding before them felt like forbidden territory. Their parents had gone to bed hours ago, leaving the twins alone in the dimly lit room. As the movie progressed, the atmosphere grew heavier. A particularly intimate scene began to play. A woman undressed slowly, her movements deliberate, before climbing onto a man who lay shirtless on a bed. The couple kissed passionately, their hands exploring each other in ways that made the air in the room feel charged. Kemi glanced at Tunde, her curiosity piqued by his reaction. He was fixated on the screen, his breathing slightly uneven. She smirked, leaning closer to him. "You're really into this, aren't you?" she teased, her voice low and playful. Tunde chuckled nervously, avoiding her gaze. "It's just a movie, Kemi, don't make it weird." But Kemi wasn't one to let things go so easily. She shifted closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What if we, tried it? Just to see what it's like." Tunde froze, his mind racing. "Kemi, that's insane. We're siblings. This isn't right." She rolled her eyes, undeterred. "Come on, Tunde. We're adults now. It's not like anyone has to know." The tension between them was palpable, a dangerous mix of curiosity and recklessness. Tunde stood abruptly, his voice firm. "No. This is wrong and you know it." Without another word, he retreated to his room, leaving Kemi alone with her thoughts. The next morning, their parents left for work early as usual. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence amplifying the unresolved tension from the night before. Kemi hadn't forgotten their conversation. If anything, her resolve had only grown stronger. Later that afternoon, Tunde stepped out of the bathroom, a towel slung low around his waist. He was applying lotion to his arms when he felt a sudden presence behind him. Before he could react, Kemi's hand brushed against his skin, her touch deliberate and unsettling. "Kemi, what are you doing?" Tunde demanded, stepping away. "This has to stop." But Kemi was relentless. "Why are you acting like you don't want this?" she whispered, her voice dripping with persuasion. "We're both adults. It's not like we're hurting anyone." Tunde's resolve wavered, torn between his instincts and the strange allure of her words. "Fine," he said finally, his voice low. "But this stays between us. No one can ever know." Kemi nodded, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. She led him to her room, where the air felt charged with anticipation. What followed was a moment of reckless abandon, a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. Kemi undressed slowly, her movements deliberate as she lay on the bed. Tunde hesitated, his heart pounding, but the curiosity that had been gnawing at him since the night before won out. He joined her, their bodies entwined in a way that felt both thrilling and wrong. The room was filled with the sounds of their shared recklessness, a dangerous secret that neither of them could take back. But their secret didn't stay hidden for long. Their neighbour, Mrs. Chinedu, had been tending to her garden when she heard strange noises coming from the house. Peering through the window, she was met with a sight that left her stunned. Without hesitation, she stormed into the house, her voice sharp with disapproval. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her eyes blazing. "This is an abomination. Your parents need to hear about this immediately." Tunde scrambled to cover himself, his face flushed with shame. "It wasn't my idea," he stammered. Kemi, she made me do it. Kemi, however, remained eerily calm. Auntie, you're overreacting, she said coolly. We were just playing around. It's not a big deal. Mrs. Chinedu wasn't convinced. Playing around? Do you think I'm blind? This is unacceptable, and your parents will hear every detail. As Mrs. Chinedu stormed out, Tunde turned to Kemi, his voice trembling. You see what you've done? We're going to be in so much trouble. Kemi shrugged, her expression unreadable. Relax, Tunde. We'll figure it out. We always do. But, as the weight of their actions settled in, Tunde couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change forever. The line they had crossed was one that could never be erased, and the consequences of their curiosity would haunt them for years to come. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the air felt heavy with unspoken tension. The Okafor family had just finished dinner, and the house was settling into its usual nighttime rhythm. Mrs. Okafor sat at the dining table, scrolling through her phone, while Kemi and Tunde lounged in the living room, their heads bent close together as they whispered and laughed over something on Tunde's phone. Earlier that day, Mama Chinedu, their ever-nosy neighbour, had paid an unexpected visit. She had knocked on the door, her face a mask of concern, and pulled Mrs. Okafor aside. My sister, I saw something today, Mama Chinedu had said, her voice low and urgent. I was passing by your window and I saw Kemi and Tunde. They were acting strange. Too close, if you ask me. I just thought you should know. Mrs. Okafor had frowned, her patience wearing thin. Mama Chinedu, you know how much you love to gossip. My children are adults and they're entitled to their privacy. Unless you have proof of something wrong, I suggest you leave them be. Mama Chinde had huffed, clearly offended. I'm only trying to help. If you don't want to listen, that's on you. With that, she had left, muttering under her breath. Now, as Mrs. Okafor watched her children from the corner of her eye, she couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. They were whispering again, their voices barely audible, and when she walked into the room, they quickly hid Tunde's phone. What are you two up to? Mrs. Okafor asked, her tone light but probing. Kemi looked up, her smile a little too bright. Nothing, Mum, just watching a funny video. Tunde nodded, though his eyes darted away nervously. Yeah, just killing time before bed. Mrs. Okafor studied them for a moment, her instincts telling her there was more to the story, but she decided not to push, for now. All right, don't stay up too late. You both have work tomorrow. We won't, Mum, Kemi assured her, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Later that night, Mrs. Okafor was in her room, preparing for an important presentation the next day. She reached for her laptop, only to realize it was dead. Frustrated, she searched for her charger but couldn't find it. Sighing, she decided to ask Kemi and Tunde if they had seen it. As she approached Kemi's room, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. Peeking inside, she found the room empty. Her heart skipped a beat. Where could Kemi be at this hour? She made her way to Tunde's room, her footsteps soft on the carpeted floor. Before she could knock, she heard faint whispers coming from inside. She paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob, and listened. Do you think Mum suspects anything? Kemi's voice was barely audible. I don't know, Tunde replied, his tone uneasy. But we need to be more careful. If Mama Shendo saw us, who knows who else might? Mrs. Okafor's stomach churned. What were they hiding? She pushed the door open, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. Kemi and Tunde were sitting on the bed, their heads close together, and they quickly pulled apart when they saw her. Mum, Kemi exclaimed, her voice tinged with guilt. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, Mrs. Okafor said, her voice sharp. Why are you in Tundi's room at this hour? Kemi forced a smile. We're twins, Mum. We like staying together. I just came to chat for a bit. Tunda nodded, though his face was pale. Yeah, we were just talking, nothing serious. Mrs. Okafor crossed her arms, her gaze shifting between them. What were you whispering about? And why did you hide your phone earlier? Kemi and Tunde exchanged a panicked look. It's nothing, Mum, Kemi said quickly. We were just talking about something private. It's not a big deal. Private? Mrs. Okafor repeated, her voice rising. What could possibly be so private that you have to hide it from me? Tunde hesitated, then said, It's just personal stuff. You wouldn't understand. Mrs. Okafor's frown deepened. Try me. I'm your mother. I deserve to know what's going on. Kemi and Tunde exchanged another glance, their silence speaking volumes. Finally, Kemi sighed. Mum, it's really nothing. We're just figuring some things out, that's all. Mrs. Okafor studied them, her instincts screaming that there was more to the story, but without proof, she couldn't push further. All right, she said finally. But I don't like this secrecy. If there's something going on, I expect you to tell me. Understood? Kemi and Tundi nodded, their relief palpable. We will, Mum, Kemi said. We're sorry for worrying you. Mrs. Okafor sighed, her anger fading into concern. Just be careful, okay? I don't want people like Mama Chinedu spreading rumours about you. We will, Mum, Tunde assured her. We promise. As Mrs. Okafor left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. But for now, she decided to give them the benefit of the doubt. After all, they were her children, and she wanted to believe the best of them. But as she lay in bed that night, her mind raced with questions. What were Kemi and Tunde really hiding? And how far would they go to keep their secret? The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the Okafor family's dining table. Mrs. Okafor hummed softly as she set down a plate of fried plantains, the smell filling the room. Kemi and Tunde sat at the table, their heads bent low as they picked at their food. The tension between them was palpable, though Mrs. Okafor seemed oblivious. Kemi, you've barely touched your food, Mrs. Okafor said, her brow furrowed with concern. Are you feeling okay? Kemi forced a smile, though her face was pale. I'm fine, Mum, just not very hungry. Mrs. Okafor studied her daughter for a moment, then turned to Tunde. And you? You're awfully quiet this morning. Tun shrugged, avoiding her gaze. Just tired, I guess. Mrs. Okafor sighed, shaking her head. You two have been acting strange lately. Is something going on? Kemi and Tunde exchanged a quick glance before Kemi shook her head. No, Mum, everything's fine. Before Mrs. Okafor could press further, Kemi suddenly stood up, her hand flying to her mouth. I need to use the bathroom, she stammered, before rushing out of the room. Mrs. Okafor frowned, her concern growing. What's wrong with her? She's been looking pale all morning. Tundi shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I don't know, Mum. Maybe she's just not feeling well. Mrs. Okafor sighed, her gaze lingering on the hallway where Kemi had disappeared. I hope it's nothing serious. In the bathroom, Kemi leaned over the sink, her body trembling as she fought back another wave of nausea. She splashed water on her face, trying to steady her breathing. The door creaked open, and Tun slipped inside, his face filled with worry. Are you okay? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Kemi shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. No, Tunde, I'm not okay. I can't keep pretending like everything's fine. Tunde hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. We'll figure this out, Kemi, I promise. Kemi turned to him, her voice trembling. How, Tunde? How are we going to figure this out? I'm pregnant and we have no money, no plan, nothing. Tunde's jaw tightened, his mind racing. I've been looking online. There are options, but we'll need money. Kemi's eyes widened. Options? What kind of options? Tunde glanced at the door, making sure it was closed, then lowered his voice. There are clinics, places where they can take care of it, but it's not cheap. Kemi's heart sank. How much? Tunde hesitated, then said, More than we have, but we'll find a way. Maybe we can borrow from someone? Kemi shook her head, her panic rising. Who would lend us money for something like this? And what if they ask questions? What if they tell Mum? Tunde ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. I don't know, Kemi, but we can't just do nothing. We have to figure something out. Kemi leaned against the sink, her legs feeling weak. This is a nightmare, Tunde. What are we going to do? Tunde took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. We'll figure it out, but for now we need to keep this between us. Mum can't find out. Not yet. Kemi nodded, though her fear was written all over her face. What if she already suspects something? She's been watching us more closely lately. Tunde's expression darkened. We'll just have to be more careful. No more slipping up. No more acting suspicious. Kemi wiped her tears, her voice barely a whisper. I'm scared, Tunde. What if we can't fix this? Tunde pulled her into a hug, his voice firm. We will, Kemi, I promise. We'll figure something out. Back in the dining room, Mrs. Okafor sat in silence, her breakfast forgotten. The sound of Kemi's retching still echoed in her mind, and the look on Tunde's face had done nothing to ease her worries. She stood up, her resolve hardening. Whatever was going on, she needed to know. She walked to the bathroom, her footsteps slow but deliberate. As she approached, she heard faint whispers and the sound of Tunde's voice, low and urgent. She paused outside the door, her heart pounding. We'll figure something out, Tunde was saying, his voice barely audible. But we need to stay calm. Mum can't find out. Mrs. Okafor's breath caught in her throat. What were they talking about? Her hand hovered over the doorknob, but before she could push it open, Kemi spoke. I'm scared, Tunde. Kemi's voice was trembling, barely above a whisper. What if we can't fix this? Mrs. Okafor's heart sank. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. She stepped back from the door, her hands shaking. She couldn't confront them now, not without knowing the full truth. But one thing was clear. Something was very... Later that evening, Kemi and Tunde sat in Tunde's room, their heads bent close together as they scrolled through Tunde's phone. The screen displayed search results for clinics and procedures, but the prices made their hearts sink. It's too much, Kemi whispered, her voice filled with despair. We'll never be able to afford this. Tunde clenched his fists, his frustration evident. There has to be another way. Maybe we can sell something or find someone who can help us. Kemi shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Who would help us with something like this, Tunde? We're on our own. Tunde pulled her into a hug, his voice firm. We'll figure it out, Kemi, I promise. We just need more time. But as they sat there, the weight of their secret pressing down on them, they both knew the truth. Time was running out. To be continued. What will Kemi and Tunde do next? Will they find a way to raise the money, or will their secret be exposed? And how long can they keep their parents in the dark? Stay tuned for part 2 to find out.